Thank you for inviting me to speak today. Looking forward to sharing some information about Colorado's changes in climate. I must warn you, it tends to get a little doom and gloom sometimes when you're talking about the impacts of a warming climate, but this group seems to be in a wonderful place to kind of tackle some of these challenges and find solutions, which is great. Okay, I wanted to first announce that we have an upcoming report coming out that is called the Climate Change in Colorado Report. And this is a report that has had previous iterations for our state. There was the first publication of it in 2008 and the second publication in 2014. And so this is the latest update of that, which should be officially published next month. Really excited about that. And basically what it is just presenting is kind of the science, the how the climate is changing, how it's predicted to continue to change, and how that will change things like our water and our hazards that we experience in the state. So if you scan that QR code, it will take you to the web address that you see on the top, climatechange.colostate.edu. There's not a lot there now, but keep checking back. There will be some great stuff coming very soon. So we're going to kind of go over what are some of the things that we talk about in this report. And the first one we talk about when we talk about climate change is temperature. So here we're looking at a graphic that shows the statewide annual temperature anomalies back to 1895 and through 2022. And the anomaly is based on a 1971 to 2000 average. So taking that long-term average, and if you have the blue bar, it means it's cooler than that average, and a red bar means it's warmer than that average. And so you'll see earlier in the record, in the early 1900s, we have a lot of blue bars, and then it kind of equals out a little bit in the mid part of the century, and pretty much since 1980, we've had a heck of a lot of red bars. In fact, since the year 2000, we have only had one year that shows up as below average for temperature when comparing to that time period. Now, this latest year might actually end up on that pretty low side as well, because it actually wasn't that warm this year. But overall, we're seeing that years are a lot warmer than they used to be. So the orange dashed line shows that long-term trend. Basically, if you go back to that record that we have from NOAA, and go through to 2022, you can see that consistent linear trend is increasing. And there's also a maroon dashed line on there, and that really is to show the recent changes that we've been seeing. So not only have we been experiencing a warming climate in the long term, but a lot of that significant warming has happened since 1980. This is a look around the state. We've separated the state out into these 11 climate divisions just for a bit of easier analysis. So you'll see the plus 1.4 degrees is over that Northern Front Range communities area and the Denver metro area. And these changes are based on taking a linear trend from that 1980 to 2022 time period. And so everywhere you look, you see that warming. You'll actually notice that where most of us live, we're in the least amount of warming, but still warming. And where we see some of the largest magnitudes of warming are in the southern part and western part of the state. So we're going to switch over to precipitation, which is another really super important climate indicator and also connected in a way to climate change, even if it doesn't show those obvious changes in the climate. So this is the same graph as before, but instead of temperature anomaly, now we're looking at the precipitation anomaly for the entire state. So where you have a brown bar means it's below that 1971 to 2000 average. And where you have a green bar, it's above that average. Now you'll notice if you look at this that there are generally more brown bars than green bars. And that is something that our state is just very familiar with. The location of our state, the semi-arid climate, the high elevations really lends itself to be highly variable with very wet years sprinkled in with a lot of dry years. And so if you look at the end of the record, basically from 2000 beyond, you'll notice that we've had much more dry periods than wet periods. But we don't put a trend line on here, and that's because there isn't really an observable trend that overwhelms any of that noise that we see. Now here I am showing that if we look at our latest time period being the 21st century and take the difference in what we've seen during the 21st century with the latter half of the 20th century, we are seeing that there has been some consistent drying across the board. Not a linear trend, but definitely drier. And the greatest amount of the greatest magnitude of drying that we've seen has been in the South and the Southwest, which interestingly enough, also happens to coincide where some of that most significant warming is occurring. All right, this was a little bit of a flow diagram I made myself late one night. So I like to call this is the thing that keeps me up at night. And it's how simply warming the climate and just nudging that thermostat up just a little bit has this trickle down effect on everything that is super important for the health of our state. So right there at the top, you're starting with this warming climate, and it's either going to go both ways. For Colorado specifically, it's increasing our temperature, very confident in that. And we still have variable precipitation on the other side. So we don't know what's going to happen with precipitation. But when you increase that temperature, even with that variable precipitation, you're still going to see all these changes happening. We see changes in our monsoon just with that variable precipitation. We see changes in our snowpack, but the increasing temperature means that that snowpack is going to be less beneficial for us. It means that we're going to increase ET, and that's evaporative demand, or the amount of moisture that the atmosphere wants to take out of the ground and take away from our surface. And all these things are going to dry our soils, reduce our runoff and water supply, stress our vegetation, which is not helpful when you're talking about a longer growing season. We're increasing the risk of wildfires. And that and our more hot temperatures could mean increased risk of flash flooding. And a lot of these things are going to overall increase our demand for water, which, as most of us know here, is a very precious resource that we don't have a lot of in our state or the West. So one important point I want to make is how much temperature impacts that precipitation variability. So when we're talking about wet periods versus dry periods, it's super important to understand temperature's connection with that. So what we're looking at here, don't worry about the fancy schmancy words at the top. It's basically just a drought index. And we take the precipitation that's occurred over a 2-year period for the entire state and say how anomalously wet or dry it is. And so the green times are when it's wetter and the brown times are when it's drier, similar to that initial precipitation graphic. But this only considers precipitation in the drought index. Now, when you add in the temperature component, you're going to see this graph adjust. So I particularly want you to pay attention to what happens to those brown areas from 2000 to 2022, and what happens to those green areas in 2000 to 2022. So this is the drought index that not only includes precipitation, but includes that temperature component. I want to see if I can switch back and forth here a couple of times so you can see when we're just looking at precipitation, we have kind of these three separate drought periods that stand out since 2000. We've got 2000, 2012, 2020. And we've got a little bit of a wet period in between there, partially driven by some of the flooding in 2013 that we saw, and also very wet 2015 as well. But let's add in that temperature component again. You notice two things, that the brown areas get thicker and get more extreme in those negative numbers. And what that means is that those warmer temperatures are making those droughts, those dry times, more impactful and more extreme. And you'll also notice those green areas have come down a bit and they're not as green. And that is another thing that temperature is doing, is it's lessening the benefit of those wetter time periods. So if you've lived in Colorado for 5 minutes, you know that we're not a stranger to drought. And this is a snapshot of the U.S. Drought Monitor since it began in January of 2000 for Colorado. So starting in 2000 and going through mid-2023, we're looking at the percentage of the state that is in each of those drought categories. And so you can see the color legend at the bottom showing you the different drought categories, and you can see how frequent drought occurs in our state. So D3, which is the red color, and D4, which is the maroon or brick red, are the worst drought categories. Typically, you're going to think of these in a frequency of D3 being a 1 in 20 year to 1 in 50 year event. And a D4, the worst drought category, would be on a return interval of 1 in 50 years to 1 in 100 years. And we've had 4 of those in our state in the last 20 years. So it's something that unfortunately we have always had to contend with, but it's getting worse with climate change. So where in the state is drought most frequent? Based on a couple of the earlier graphics, you might not be too surprised to learn where we see drought most often. So in both of these graphics, I've just taken the number of weeks since 2000 that each county has been in a D2, D3, or D4 drought on the left side. And then on the right side, just that very worst category of D4. So this went through 2019. And as of 2019, those counties in white had not experienced a D4 drought. That has since changed, unfortunately. But what you'll notice on this is that the drought frequency and severity is much more prevalent on the southern side of the state. So the South is where we have the most vulnerability to these droughts in terms of them changing in frequency and in intensity. So this is a favorite graphic that I like to show, and it's pretty complicated, but I like to kind of step back and take the time to explain it because it's really super interesting. This was a study done by a group from NOAA and NIDIS, which is the National Integrated Drought Information System. They put out this drought task force report that focused on the southwestern U.S. drought that occurred in 2020 to 2021. And Colorado was a big part of that. And so what they were looking at was not just the changes in precipitation, but the changes in vapor pressure deficit. Now, that's just a very complicated meteorological term that basically means how dry is the air. So the bigger the deficit, the more dry the air is. So we're not just talking about precipitation deficits, but the air itself is not holding those water vapor molecules. It's not in there, even if it could hold it. And so this little schematic I put on the right side is to help you out in this. And what they did was they took all of the years for the Southwest US and looked at the relationship between precipitation anomalies and dry air anomalies. And so overall, you find this general pattern that you would like to see, that diagonal line. Basically, when you have less precipitation, that happens with drier air. And when you have more precipitation, the air isn't as dry. It's pretty self-explanatory in that sense. But when we look at the individual dots on here, we start to identify patterns. And the key that they were looking at is how extreme was the precipitation anomaly for this drought, and how extreme was the dry air anomaly for this drought. What they found out was that the precipitation anomaly was within the realm of what has happened in our historical record. So it was extremely dry in terms of precipitation anomaly, but that anomaly was equally possible and likely to happen in our past climate, as it is in our current climate, as it is in our future climate. But the dry air had never before been experienced in our past climate. It's even super extreme for our current climate, but it has the possibility of recurring in our future climates, which means that what happened in 2020 to 2021, the drought that we experienced, was so extreme and something we had never experienced, but it is in that likelihood, that probability of happening in our future climate. And this dry air has a lot of super important impacts to talk about. One of them is our changes in wildfire. And 2020 was off the charts in terms of what Colorado experienced with wildfire, in terms of the total area in acreage that was burned. And so this is a graphic that's looking at the observations of wildfire in terms of number of fires over 10,000 acres and the total area burned throughout the entire year back to the 1980s, just because we don't have a lot of good records prior to then. But you'll notice some years like 2002 stick out like a sore thumb. That was the year of the Hayman fire, also a really bad drought. And that was the first year that Colorado knew we could experience a 100,000 acre fire in just one fire. And unfortunately, now we know from 2020 that we can experience 100,000 acre fires. We can experience 200,000 acre fires. Now, this doesn't include 2021 on here, which the number of fires is not as large and the total area burned is not as large, but it is an excellent example of how our wildfire risk is going to be a really important component when we're talking about our wildland urban interface, which includes a lot of the Front Range urban communities. So I'm going to switch over and talk about water a little bit and how the warming climate impacts our water. So Colorado is what's known as a headwater state. Based on where we are relative to the continental divide, all the water in our state starts here and then leaves. So we don't have water that really enters our state from somewhere else. We have a tiny little bit of the Little Snake, but not much. And then aside from the Republican River that starts out from the Eastern Plains and goes out to Kansas, all of our starts is that mountain snowpack. And so here we are looking at the relative contributions of each river to how much leaves our state. And so you can see all of our major rivers here, the South Platte, the Arkansas, the Rio Grande, and by far the biggest one being the Colorado River. And that arrow is to scale compared to the other arrows in how much water leaves our state and goes downstream once it's picked up its water here. And so obviously you can see we're surrounded by states on all sides. all of our neighboring states benefit from water that starts here, which means our state is super important in that way. And warming temperatures are impacting our snowpack, which is how all that water starts. So when you have this normal snowpack accumulating season where your snowpack peaks in April, that's when you have the most water stored in your snow, and then it starts to gradually melt. You're looking at the accumulated water from the river being fairly equally distributed between the cold season and the warm season. But if you go to the right side and you see that you take away some of that snowpack from its nice timely melting in the spring months, it means that you'll have less in the river during the warm months. And so it's it increases that difference between when we get the water versus when we use the water. And I've got a couple maps here to show kind of our recent trends in snowpack. So this is taking our snow tell stations across the state and the ones that have records back to the late 1970s, early 1980s, and through 2022. What are the trends in the date of the peak? So when they get their highest amount and before they start melting, typically that's happening in early to mid-April is when we generally tend to see that, but we have been seeing a trend towards earlier dates. And so those bigger, darker red dots are where we've seen the biggest changes, particularly if we're looking at those southern mountains. And then this is looking at the change in amount. So when you take that peak amount, regardless of the date it occurs, how much is in there, and there's actually less than there used to be. And in some points, that's partially driven by the earlier date, but also that there's less falling in the early fall season or in the spring season to help build up that peak. Our future projections for water are primarily driven by our future projections for temperature. So here we're looking at those observed temperature changes. The black solid line is showing those observed temperatures that we looked at earlier. And now we've put over it what the climate models show for the historic record back to 1950 and through our observed record, and then continuing on forward what they project would happen by the year 2100. And this is a middle range scenario, which you might notice lines up fairly well with the observed temperatures. It doesn't capture the variability, so it doesn't capture, which specific year is going to be wetter or drier, but it captures that overall trend and shows that that trend is going to continue late into the 21st century. It's a bit of a different story when we talk about the changes in precipitation. So instead of showing you that line graph, a bit of a different way to look at it is to show the range of models. And so we've got two climate model rectangles on here, CMIP 5 and CMIP 6. I'm not going to go into what those are, but if you have questions, we can go over it. But CMIP 5, there's 37 models for that change in precipitation by 2050. And then the CMIP 6 has 22 models in there. And basically, it's that overall range of how is the precipitation going to change from that 1971 to 2000 time period. And most of those changes are not very big. And we have models that show wetter and models that show drier, and we don't know which way it's going to go. So similar to what we have in our observations, we know the temperatures are warming. We don't know what's going to happen with precipitation. Unfortunately, regardless of what happens with precipitation, we know that those warming temperatures are going to impact the water in our state. And so in this example, we're looking at different areas of the state at what their April 1st snowpack change is going to be from that 1971 to 2000 period into the future to 2050. And if it has a purple shading, that means it's projected to see an increase in that snowpack amount, and the orange is a decrease in that snowpack amount. And you'll see that across the board, more are showing decreases than increases. The exception would be the South Platte, which shows a lot of uncertainty. And then one of the most notable ones there is the San Juan Mountains in southern Colorado. All of them are showing really that reduction in snowpack, regardless of changes in precipitation. This is picking kind of one of those sites. We're looking at the Colorado River headwaters. How is the snowpack going to accumulate, peak, and melt out in our future climate? So the black line shows what we expect from now from what our snowpack does. So we start in October. We start building up that snowpack with each event, snow accumulating event that occurs, and we reach that peak in mid-April. That's when our snowpack is the highest, and then we start to see the melting and full melt out by July or August. All of the purple lines are the different model projections at that site of what the snowpack accumulation could look like. And then the thick dash line is just the median of all of those. And overall, the story that we're looking at here is that even though the peak date is similar, we're still looking at a peak in early to mid-April. The peak is lower and the melting is faster. And so we melt out earlier and we don't get as much. And that's going to translate to reduced runoff and stream flow, which is directly going to impact the amount of water that we can use from that snowpack. So in this graphic, we're looking at the Colorado River headwaters, and each dot represents the model projections temperature change versus precipitation change. So in here, you can see that if you are above that gray dash line, those are models that are predicting an increased precipitation change. All of them are showing warmer temperature changes, and about half of them are showing increases in precipitation, with the other half showing decreases in precipitation. Now, the color and size of the dot is based on the runoff. So if it's red, it's reduced runoff. And if it's blue, it's increased runoff. There are only a few blue dots on there. And in fact, the blue dots only happen if we had a 5% greater than a 5% increase in our precipitation, which doesn't have a strong likelihood of happening. So overall, this is showing that regardless of those precipitation changes, with our temperature changes, we know that we're going to have a reduction in our runoff and water supply. One other interesting thing to show is really about that timing and how important it is. So this is back to the Colorado River headwaters, and what's the projected changes in soil moisture. If it's brown, it means drier soils. If it's blue, it means wetter soils. So you'll notice right around March, April, May, we're seeing an increase towards wetter soils by 2050, and then drier soils after that. And that is largely due to that earlier peak in the snowpack, and the earlier and faster runoff means we're going to have more water than we used to in the spring, and then it's going to dry out in the summer earlier and a little bit more than it used to. So key takeaways here that we know that our temperatures have warmed and they are going to continue to warm. Precipitation is highly variable, but we do know that droughts are very common. Our warmer temperatures are going to worsen the drought and decrease the benefit of those wetter years. And it's likely that our water supply will continue to decrease as our demand for it increases. So the forecast is we're all going to die and there will be no one left to remember our stories. So happy to give you that wonderful bit of information. All right, but I spent about 30 minutes on the doom and gloom, and here's your 30 seconds of hope. Do what you're doing now. Staying climate aware, listening to talks like this and learning more about the climate is super important. Knowing what's coming increases our preparedness and planning. Staying involved with your communities and local governments is going to help. I also want to point out that there are a lot of national, state, and local efforts that are really focused on adaptation. And that's where we're talking about, we know that climate change is already happening, and so we want to prepare for that. That's part of the adaptation realm of things, and there's a lot going on there that's really exciting. And then in terms of probably where a lot of you sit are looking more at mitigation. So there's a lot of excitement in the world of mitigation and renewable energy that's saying, yep, the climate is warming now, but let's see if we can lessen the warming that may happen in the future. And so I just wanted to point to a couple of successful efforts that I've looked into. You all probably know about these. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but these are ones that stick out in my mind. And so I wanted to end on a little bit more of a positive note. But what I'm going to bring up is renewable energy at CSU Spur campus in Denver. So this is a Colorado State University effort with building this huge campus in the National Western Center complex in North Denver. So right by where you go to the stock show every January. And they've got these amazing buildings that they've put up. And one of the buildings that they've put up is to use wastewater to basically run the heating and cooling needs for the entire National Western complex. And so this is really an interesting concept that wastewater really equals heat. So when we're talking wastewater, we're not just talking about what you're flushing down your toilets, but we're talking about the shower water that goes down the drain, or the dishwasher water, or the water from your washing machine going down these drains, and is actually quite hot. And Denver had to spend a lot of money. Once they take that wastewater and treat it, then they have to make sure that it's cool enough to enter back into the South Platte River. And a lot of money and energy is used to cool that water. But basically what you're looking at, 350 billion kilowatt hours of heat energy going down the drains from Denver every year. And what the Spur campus did was they said, oh, well, we're going to make this building and invest in some of these fancy heat pumps and develop this system that covers 90% of the campus's heating and cooling needs. And so basically it eliminates what they would have used would be 2,600 metric tons of CO2 every year, or the equivalent of eliminating 6.6 million vehicles from the roadways. So great project there. It's actually got a lot of national attention, as this is an example of how you can use what's already there to make energy usable. The other one I wanted to touch on, which is still kind of a relatively new concept, and I don't know personally a lot about it, but I'm hearing a lot about it, is agrivoltaics. And that's where we're combining that renewable solar energy with crops. And so much of Colorado is cropland that this is a great opportunity. And I happen to find that the Colorado Department of Agriculture actually has $500,000 in grants that they are taking grant applications now in the hopes that not only will there be research done on the benefits and costs of agrivoltaics in Colorado, but that they'll actually have some of the producers and operations install the instruments and start an agrivoltaic operation, either over croplands or grazing lands. And so I think this is really a great opportunity to broaden the benefit of so much land that we have that can go to uses for multiple benefits. Again, we've got our Climate Change in Colorado report coming, so I encourage you all to check that out next month. And that is all I have for you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Bolinger. We've got a couple comments and we've got a question. I'm going to call on Laurie D first. Laurie, if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it, or are you able to unmute? Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Good.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. And thank you, Dr. Bolinger, for your time. And that was really some great info. I've always been against the Gross Dam expansion. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, pros and cons, or if you have anything to say about Gross Dam expansion.
Yeah.
10 years, there may not even be enough water to fill the damn thing up.
Yeah, you know, it's a really tough situation. We have a similar one going on in northern Colorado that we're talking about with Blade Reservoir. One of the points to make is that Colorado has never used its fully allotted amount of the Colorado River because we haven't had the option to. And so that's one side of the argument. And another very valid side of the argument is, but there's not enough to go around. And I think that the biggest hitching points are really going to be our lower basin states reducing their usage. And what needs to happen is some update to the compact that says we don't share water equally based on a compact that was written 100 years ago. That climate no longer exists. That water is not there. Coloradans have been very well aware of this fact since the drought of 2002. And unfortunately, that's not the same story for Arizona and California. And so what needs to happen is, and we have amazing people in Colorado working on this and protecting our rights and indigenous rights to water. But overall, everybody's going to have to reduce the use. And so it is possible that, after all this, we may be able to get some water, save some of our own water that was supposed to be initially slated for us anyway, but all went downstream. But overall, yeah, the real message is everybody's going to be using less in order for us to keep using the system.
Well, thank you. We've got a bunch of hands. I'm just going to call on David Bowden.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. Dr. Bolinger, thank you for a very informative presentation and all the slides. And I took a few stills of them so I can absorb some of that scientific information. And thank you for that research and accuracy.
Excellent.
I've been following Colorado water issues for a while, among many other things. And I used to work for Denver Water just as a contractor. And so I'm well aware that municipal water utilities are taking the information that you compile very seriously. But I have great concerns about farmers in the agricultural community who are much less skeptical, much less believing and much more skeptical about scientific research such as you presented today, just now. And so I'm wondering, is there a substantial effort by the state to get these accurate figures out to people whose livelihoods depend on water, like farmers? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. There is, I would say, there's a lot of work with agriculture, and some of it is welcomed and some of it is not. And um, there's a general pushback by the agricultural community to not have a really accurate accounting of the water, because there's the fear that they'll lose more if you know how much they get. And so that is an area where there's some pushback. But generally, when you tell them, we know it's getting drier and the water you get is not going as far, they know that. So even if you don't use the words climate change, they see it on their farms, and they know that that water is becoming less beneficial, and there's not as much of it there. And so I think ultimately, in order for our agriculture to thrive, there's going to have to be a certain amount of trust given to how our state fights for our water rights. And that's really what it comes down to is they're only going to be trusting if they know that they're still going to be able to get water to do the jobs that they want to do. And I think that's probably where the biggest hitching points are, is when people say, well, we shouldn't be farming, or you use more of the water and you can't use water, and why do we have farms here? I think that leads to a lot of the defensiveness. Whereas if you say, we're going to figure out a solution, and then it's, getting some of the younger farmers in there who are more open to trying different practices, because that's also an interesting, you got a lot of farmers are like, well, my grandfather did it, my great grandfather did it, I'm going to do the same thing. Well, what worked 100 years ago does not work now. Call it what you want, but the climate is different. And so we've noticed that the farmers that are very well averse about climate are more interested in trying different management practices, and are generally more prepared for some of the volatility that they see. I hope that answered the question.
Well, it's a hard question to answer, and it's a difficult scenario for people to accept. And you did a great job of explaining it. And I hope more people start to accept the facts as you presented them. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Okay, I see 2 hands up. I beg your patience a moment. There is a comment in the chat from a gentleman who posted much earlier on. I'd like to get the comment out, then I'll come to the question. Alan, I think I'll call on you next, Alan, if your hand is still up. Yes. This gentleman's, I'm going to read the comment first, but I'll call in a moment. Okay, Alan?
Okay.
In reference to an earlier graph you presented, Dr. Bolinger, the precipitation graph versus time graph, this person comments that it might benefit from including an El Nino and La Nina cycle pattern overlaid over that. Any?
Yes, we don't have that. It's not always a perfect relationship, but there is generally this idea that some of the dryness, that the persistent dryness that we've experienced since the 2000s aligns pretty well with the consistency of the large frequency of La Ninas that we've had, and that overall some areas of our state do benefit from a La Nina, particularly the northern mountains in a La Nina winter. But a lot of the state trends a little bit drier. But here's that hitching point, is last year was a La Nina, and we just finished one of our wettest water years on record, particularly for the northeast part of the state. And so it's not always a perfect relationship, but there is that relationship there that El Nino, La Nina does drive some of that variability that we see. And we're not entirely sure what the future will mean for trends in La Nina or El Nino. Is the higher frequency of La Nina that we've observed, is that due to climate change, or is that internal variability? And we don't know the answer to that. So thank you for bringing that up.
Ellen, yes, go ahead with your question.
Dr. Bolinger, I accepted an assignment to write about some of the stuff you've been talking about tonight. I have to do this during November, December. Basically, what is happening with our snowpack? Why doesn't it yield the runoff? And my task, in part, is to put the story on the ground. And I can think of at least one rancher on the Snake River that would probably be of assistance to talk about soil moisture and that sort of thing. But if you were in my shoes, trying to put the story on the ground instead of using it with charts, are there any suggestions you might have? And I might tell you also that I'm going to Grand Junction, Paonia here in a few weeks, and also Southeast Colorado, as well as Southern Colorado.
Yeah, I know, for example, specifically in the San Luis Valley, there has been some challenges. Particularly, there's not a lot of reliance on reservoir storage there. So it's all, when the runoff happens, that's when we use the water. And so I think the example is not this last water year, but the water year before. The peak snowpack was okay. It wasn't great, but it was okay. And then there was just a really fast melting, and they melted out on the San Juan Mountains about a month early. And so farm operations there had to adjust their scheduling to try to get that water when it was available, knowing that when they would typically use it, it is no longer there because it's already run down the river. And so I think that's a perfect example right there of, it's not just the amount of water, but the timing of when it comes is changing. And that's having a huge impact, especially if you irrigate based on the runoff and not from a reservoir.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jan, go ahead.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Dr. Bolinger. I ran a bill last session to require the fracking industry to conserve fresh water, because at a minimum, they're now indicating that they're using 24 million gallons per well per frack, which in the last 2 or 3 years has added up to 4 trillion gallons of fresh water. Clearly, this is not the 3% of water that we are assigning to industrial sources. And the primary reason it's not the 3% is that they're buying their water from Frico, the Front Range irrigation company, right, and the Rocky Mountain Ditch Organization. So in other words, they're buying farmers' water. And so in terms of the state of Colorado, the water used for fracking appears to be used for agriculture. So my question to you is, are you in fact segregating in your climate report this year out of CSU? Are you actually looking at the true amount of water being used for fracking? Or are you still classifying them as 3%?
Yep. So we don't delineate between how the water is used. It's really just based on the runoff. And so regardless of what happens upstream of runoff, or, upstream of that or downstream of that, we don't do accounting for. And I can say, there's lots of reuses of water. Some are good, and some, like fracking may cause concern. I'm not going to say that as the Assistant State Climatologist. I'm going to say that as a personal citizen, that I get very nervous thinking of what that means when fracking uses our water. But there's the idea that if you can put water back into the system, and if it's a beneficial use, that's really how it's accounted for at the state level. And, there are other ways that water is recycled. Say right now is a perfect example where Colorado River water, Eagle River water, Blue River water is largely being used to help shoot off those snow guns that are going to make our ski resorts skiable in the next couple of weeks. And that water goes back into the system, which is why it's something that's considered acceptable. And so I don't know if all of that accounting for water that goes back into the system really is as, I don't want to say not as important, but it's not as strictly accounted for. We really talk about consumptive use, meaning water that we're going to lose to the atmosphere. And that's where we think it's lost. We can't use it anymore.
So you don't think consumptive use is fracking?
No, there's some of it's going to be evaporated, but a lot of it they're putting back into the system, right?
As toxic water, as produced water, which they inject underground because it's too toxic to put into the streams.
Yes, and that's the next key is, which I'm less familiar with, and I'm totally on board with you on that. But in terms of consumptive use being water that completely leaves the system via the atmosphere is the way they look at consumptive use. And so if they put water back into the system, be it groundwater, surface water, or runoff, I'm not even touching on the quality of the water, but that's how it's accounted for, I think. And I think you raise very valid concerns about it that I definitely agree with.
Yeah, Dave, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask?
Thank you. Another question, Dr. Bolinger. Any substantial results from cloud seeding?
Yeah, so cloud seeding has been an effort that has been tried and tried again for a lot of years. There's a lot of really strong proponents for it. And there's not a lot of really solid results on it. What I can say is that cloud seeding is only going to work when the moisture is there and the clouds are there. And so generally tend to find that if we're in a very bad drought, you're really not going to have the ingredients you need for cloud seeding to help anything. And you also can't do cloud seeding when it's really wet. So there's this little window of slightly below average to slightly above average precipitation where you can try to do cloud seeding. And then the benefits are found to be pretty nominal in terms of the percent of increase. So overall, there's still lots of efforts to try to make it successful, but there's not really any clear results that that's going to help increase our water that's available, or that it would take water away from somewhere else.
Thank you. No silver bullet from the silver iodine, right?
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see. There is a comment from Jan. Jan, do you just want to go ahead and unmute yourself and raise your comment? It's the one about when Al Gore came to town in 2017.
Thanks. Not only have I already hogged the time, but with the fracking question, but I think everybody knows that climate change between 2017 and 2023 looks worse than ever. And so I don't think I need to belabor it. Thanks, Greg.
Any other questions or comments?
Thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Very important stuff.
Very much so. We'll give each other
I'll
for a
ask
little
a question
while.
if it's all right.
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah. Hey, I'm curious if you know much about adaptation mitigation measures being considered. This early runoff of the snowpack issue seems to beg giant storage projects, which I know are quite controversial. But what's being discussed out there? What do you think is likely to come around?
You know, best I know of right now is the big focus is on the Colorado River Compact and preserving our water rights in that. Otherwise, I know, it's really hard to get storage projects off the ground for good reason. And they're glacially slow. So I think some more innovative methods in terms of protecting crops will be considered. Some of the things, just management of crops are, no-till. Cover crops is something that a lot of agriculture has considered to kind of adapt to a changing climate. But the challenge in that is that your cover crop takes water. So for Colorado, that might not be a viable solution. But anything, considering how to, like you said, use the water when you have it, I think is going to be critical. But you're right, that's something that will have to be considered in adaptation is adjusting the timing of when you're going to get the water for your crop.
I have a question. It's something I've been wondering about for a while. There had been some discussion of allowing homeowners to recapture their rainwater, to install gray water reclamation systems, to reserve some of that water and reuse it on your lawn. And I've also heard that that was a violation of Colorado law. If you divert water that's going to run off your property, then you would be violating our requirement to divert the water downstream. And I always thought it seemed like if you capture that water, you're only holding it momentarily, and you're releasing into the lawn anyway, just redistributing. What are the latest developments in terms of that type of, I guess it would be ordinances, or would it be laws? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's so interesting because when you think about Colorado, where you think every drop of water that comes to the sky is owned by somebody. But really, I think I remember probably a decade ago where it's like you cannot collect water in a rain barrel because that water belongs to somebody downstream. So if you collect it, it's not running off. And so the idea being that that water is supposed to go downstream. Now, I'm sure they must have done some sort of accounting to change those rules where they said, yes, you can have rain barrels and there's specific guidelines on that, where I'm sure they found that it was, the proverbial drop in the bucket, not really going to impact how the farmer downstream on the South Platte is getting their water. If you're using it from a rain bucket and then you don't have to irrigate, that's less that's going to irrigation and then will go off down into the system anyway. So I think overall it's considered a pretty small amount, but just knowing that probably the biggest way to lose that water is to use your water in the heat of the day. Because it's more likely going to the atmosphere and benefit nobody. Whereas if you are, doing it late in the day, early in the morning, where you're not worrying about large evaporative losses, it's going to be better for your lawn. You're going to get bigger bang for your buck. Heck, if you water your lawn when it's raining, the farmer downstream is going to be happy because all of it's running off and just going directly back into the river. So it's just you spending money for nothing. But overall, I think, the biggest impact is going to be that watering on hot in the middle of a hot day. That's when that's really not going to benefit anybody. It's just going to go right back in the atmosphere.
Actually, I'm sorry to be hogging attention too, but it's a question I've been hanging on to for a long time and pondering. I'm by no means an expert in this, and I may be misinformed, but I read an article some years ago that Israel, being situated in a desert, is actually a water exporter and an agricultural exporter, and they achieved this through updating, dramatically reinventing their agricultural practices. And again, it's a long time ago when I read this article. The only things that stick in my mind is they use techniques like wet walls, not exactly sure what that is, greenhouses, drip irrigation, and maybe something even more extreme than drip irrigation where they're bury the lines or something and feed the water right to the roots. And despite being in a desert, they export water to, I think Lebanon and maybe Jordan. And then they also are produce exporters. Is there any, how governments, state governments, city governments always travel to other places to learn? Is there any program or campaign or any cross sharing of information with places like Israel and their techniques or similar climates?
I don't know. I can say that probably one of the bigger challenges we have is just our size. Like, we are so much bigger, and so that's probably one of the first challenges, is how expensive would a lot of the infrastructure changes be to make things like that successful, and where would we get the money for that would probably be our biggest challenges. And we do have examples. Unfortunately, they may not be sustainable. In Arizona, for example, where Saudi Arabia has water rights and export farm produce to Saudi Arabia. And so unfortunately, that's using Colorado River water. So I think it's overall a detriment to the system. I think I do think there can be things that we can learn from other countries and efforts. But it's going to have to be scalable to a much bigger scale when you think about the American Southwest and how big it is. But any efforts we can to increase the efficiency of our water, I know that there's a lot of efforts in the ag community. And even that's an expensive prospect, which is why you still see so many center pivots out there, like shooting sprays of sprinkler sprays instead of the drip irrigation, but also just trying to keep the water from evaporating that's on our surface. And how do you do that when we have these big giant reservoirs that evaporate more water than what we hold in Blue Mesa? Lake Mead evaporate, Lake Powell, Lake Mead evaporate more water every year than what we hold in Blue Mesa.
Wow.
And so that's a big user. Atmosphere is a big user of water. So
I did not know that.
That's something we have. And people are trying to come up with solutions there. How about ping pong balls? Just cover the reservoirs in ping pong balls. And there's actually been relevant research to find that's not going to work. That's not a solution, but perhaps there are other solutions in other countries that I do hope we're looking at, but they'll all have to be scalable.
When you said how big we are, the first thing I thought of was like, imagine a greenhouse that's growing wheat. Yeah, I don't think you grow wheat in a greenhouse. You just need miles of open field. They must be growing fruits and vegetables in
specialty crops. That's a great idea. Yeah.
Or vertical farms, they're catching on too. They use water much more efficiently.
Yeah, there's some great research efforts going on at Spur. The big Terra building does a bunch of ag research, and they've got some of the, they have a rooftop farm, and they have the vertical farms going on in their greenhouse there, which are really great ideas, very innovative.
Oh, that's good to know. Might be worth a visit. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, tour Spur if you haven't, because it's very interesting.
Yeah, will do. Thanks.
While we're talking about ways to more productively use farmland, I wanted to say that someone in the United States, Berkeley Earth maybe, did a study of what would happen if we took all the ethanol plants that are growing corn exclusively for biofuel use and put solar panels over them. And the answer was that we could power the electricity needs of the entire country if we agrivoltaiced our ethanol plants.
Wow.
Yes,
Tim,
I
you
saw
had
something similar. So basically keep farms for food and let's put solar panels everywhere. It would be huge.
Well, since you mentioned that, floating solar reduces evaporation quite a bit too. Here's a question, Becky. You had mentioned the compact negotiations. I'm curious if you're directly involved with those, and if there's any hope for progress at all, or is it going to turn into a war, or will the feds have to step in eventually and decree something?
Yeah, I get to sit on the outside and watch. It's like an exciting football game that I don't have any say in it. But I've heard quite a bit from the CWCB and Becky Mitchell, who is our Upper Colorado commissioner for the state of Colorado, is kind of fighting the good fight for us. It's contentious, and I sure hope that something can come to fruition without the federal government stepping in, because I don't know if the federal government quite understands all of the intricacies of it as the state governments who have been dealing with this for the last 20 years have. And so my hope is that some positivity will come out of it. And I have a lot of faith in our Colorado contingent who's at the table for that, because they are very smart. They know a lot. You know, they go to California and Arizona. It's a very different story there. And a lot of it is just lack of awareness. So we're kind of ahead of the ball of, when it comes to water conservation compared to the downstream neighbors. And they're kind of where we were, I think, in 2002 of like, oh, we can't just use water whenever we want it and stuff. So hopefully I'm hopeful based on the people I know in Colorado who are on it. But yeah, I get to just watch it from the outside.
Alan, you have your hand up.
I wonder, I've been following climate change research for about 20 years, and I wonder, from your perspective, from 20 years or 30 years ago, how much of what you presented tonight would be a surprise, or maybe even just a shift in understanding. Have I made my question clear, I guess?
I mean, to all audiences, or?
Well, I guess I'm looking at it in the context of Colorado. And what I can recall 20 years ago, at that point, we were saying, well, it looks like the San Juans are going to be, the southern part of the state is going to be drier, the northern part could be wetter, but we really don't know. That's what was being said 20 years ago. Well, now it seems to be playing out that way, but So that's just being one example of, but for my personally, was not paying any attention to soil moisture. I'm sure that people that work on the land were paying attention at that point, but that's something that just come into my consciousness in the last few years.
Yeah, so I would say probably the biggest surprises are the evaporative demand side of thing, where that's having a trickle down effect on drying the soils, making droughts worse, and increasing our risk for wildfires. And to me, 20 years ago, I think we were all thinking of Colorado wildfires as something that happened in the mountains. And so to me, the biggest surprise, even though it made sense that it could happen on paper, and it really shouldn't have come as a surprise, but the Marshall Fire, I think, was a real wake-up call as to what our changing climate can mean in terms of the things that the hazards and extremes that we're vulnerable to. And so I don't think that the average temperature changes or the changes that we've seen in snowpack have been really a big surprise, but what that means in terms of the extremes that we'll experience have probably been a bigger surprise.
So perhaps a way of saying that is that we're more fully understanding the effects of implications of aridification, a word I wasn't hearing 20 years ago.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
That's one way to put it. Yes.
We had a speaker here at MDCRES a couple years ago. I keep trying to remember his name. He's a farmer, but I think partners a lot with CSU. And I think he has some connections to the climate, the Colorado Climate Office too. He's a wheat farmer out on the plains, and multi-generational, and I think very successful. But he said basically, you think of us as wheat farmers, but really we're moisture farmers. He constantly just talked about the moisture profile and things like that, and it was just there's a shift in mentality how focused they are on moisture.
That was John Stolp, who was a former
That's him.
czar
Yes.
for the Hickenlooper administration, and before that, Department of Agriculture.
Yes,
executive.
thank you.
Yeah, he was a
Yes.
Colorado Commissioner of Agriculture for a while.
Yep. I do
And
know
I
this.
think and I think he had wind turbines on his property as well. I might be mistaken, but I know he was a proponent of wind power.
Sounds familiar.
Well, a lot of farmers, Kansas is very conservative. They like to have multiple revenue streams on their property. It could be wind turbines. Of course, it's the agricultural products. Even some, I guess, want to put some pump jacks, but
Got to
Can I
find
ask
the
what-
angle first.
Could I ask one more question?
absolutely.
Okay, I'll be heading down to Baca County next week again. And of course, that was near the epicenter of the Dust Bowl. And when you showed the charts early on, the southern part of the state, including the southeast, was in the drier part of what's happened in the last 20 years. Is there anything that might be said about hotter and drier in this area of our region that was at the center of the Dust Bowl 100 years ago, 90 years ago?
Reframe that question. How was it?
Well, okay, here's what I'm trying to figure out in my head. Is okay, we had the Dust Bowl 90 years ago, and now as we see a warmer, drier climate now, and we're seeing some things happening there that are, temperatures rising and whatnot.
Mhm.
Could this set us up for something similar again? I know
Oh,
we
yes.
have different land use practices, but
Yes. I mean, I would say that we've seen snippets of that, particularly in the springtime in our southeastern plains, where we get those big dust storms because of you've got these dry conditions and hot temperatures and high winds, we see the reoccurrence of that. And I think the biggest difference, like you said, is land management. So we're much better at land management, but that area is so very vulnerable to kind of the trifecta of really hot temperatures, a seasonal cycle of precipitation that's kind of strengthening, and where when you get your wet versus the dry getting even drier, and then you add in that the spring is incredibly windy, and I think all of those together really make that area super vulnerable to those types of conditions. And aside from the land management, I do think that is something that area really does have to worry about, is that prolonged sustained drought that has those huge impacts.
Thank you.
And add grass fires to that too.
Mm. Well, we got 2 minutes left. Any last questions or comments? No? Well, we'll give you the gift of 2 minutes back to your life.
Been a great discussion. Thank you, Dr. Bolinger.
Thanks. Great having some extra questions. I'm glad you guys stuck around.
Yeah, nice to have the time to talk and hear some extra stuff. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me on.